Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you on behalf of the Diplomatic Academy. We have a small but selected audience, I realize, on a day like this here in Vienna, with many things happening, some of them with international repercussions, like the 40-year anniversary and the UN Secretary here, some with national repercussions, which I don't have to comment here at all. It's a pleasure to welcome you for the already 12th Ernst Sucharipa Memorial Lecture, and let me welcome a few persons especially, and the first one is Lili Sucharipa. It's a pleasure to have you here. I would also like to welcome the last two speakers of the Ernst Sucharipa lecture, and this is also not usual that when you have such a series that you have two of the last speakers here. I welcome Larry Johnson, 2017. And I welcome my predecessor, Hans Winkler, 2018. But most certainly, I first of all would like to welcome our speaker, Ambassador Eva Nowotny. Welcome here at the Academy.
Thank you.
The talk will be moderated by Hanspeter Neuhold, who is the spiritus rector, more or less, of the whole series of Sucharipa lectures. Thank you for doing this, and welcome here at your home. Ladies and gentlemen, when we said we will have a talk about crisis, we didn't know what crisis might mean in an Austrian international context. Today we will talk about multilateralism in crisis, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that there is hardly a talk about multilateralism where it's not about defense of multilateralism, the decline of multilateralism, the crisis of multilateralism, but I'm sure we will have a question mark after the talk on the title that is being given. But let me just say, when a talk has the title Multilateralism in Crisis, it has to do certainly with the fact that we are not sure what the global world order will look like in the coming years. And multilateralism, if I may say so, and we teach this also to our students, profits from stable international order, and we don't have a stable international order at the moment, and this is certainly the main reason why we're talking about this. But maybe it also has to do with the fact, and I'm curious what our speaker will say about this, maybe it has to do with the fact that some people say we need an effective multilateralism, and actually I would say that the still Prime Minister of Austria used on various occasions the term effective multilateralism to explain the Austrian position on this aspect of international relations. And the last point I want to raise is maybe it also has to do with the fact that there is a certain dissatisfaction whether it's a just international order we are living in. And behind that, and this is, I think, a basic point, again, we try to teach our students about this, is the international order that we have based on universal values as the United Nations Charter and a lot of following documents have said, or is it an order based on Western values? Some call it neoliberal values. Even the IMF and the World Bank are discussing multilateralism in crisis because of the question mark behind universal or Western. So you see there are so many issues to be tackled, and I think there is no one in Austria who is more apt to respond to this than Eva Nowotny, and I look much forward to tonight's discussion. Thank you for coming.
Let me also thank all of you for showing your interest on this memorable day for Austria in what's happening in the rest of the world. I really don't have to introduce tonight's speaker, except perhaps to the younger members of the audience. You know the name, but let me briefly sum up Eva Nowotny's distinguished career. Eva, you studied history And this is worth mentioning because there is another person in this room who also studied history, namely Ambassador Brix. And I am, as you know, a teacher, so the question is, what do we learn from this? Very simply, that you don't have to study law to become a leading diplomat in this country. History also provides a very solid background and basis, and of course, Thomas, political science doesn't hurt either. Eva Nowotny then joined the Austrian Foreign Service in 1973, which, I mean, you joined the diplomatic service, but in this country, not only in this country, you have to pass the feared examen préalable. Your international career took you to Cairo, right? New York City, where you met the Sucharipas, incidentally, and then she became ambassador to such minor cities as Paris, London, and Washington, D.C. Back in Austria, Eva Nowotny served as advisor to two chancellors, Fritz Hinowatz and Franz Wernitzky, went on to head the section. If you're not familiar with the Austrian system, a section is the largest unit in our foreign ministry for, what was it, integration and economic policy. I tried to translate. And after retirement, Eva Nowotny became president of the Austrian UNESCO Commission. And Eva, you have come full circle because now you're our chairperson of the Universitätsrat, the University Council of her alma mater. And as Ambassador Brix said, who but you is qualified to talk about this topic? Lily and I wondered, you say, normally if you have such a topic, you add a question mark, but in this case, it's not necessary. Eva Nowotny.
I left it open.
It's so obvious.
Well, let me say first of all that I'm extremely grateful that I've been invited to give this talk this evening. I will say, come back to that at the end of my remarks, but I wanted to say that Ernst and I basically started in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the same time, and we became very close friends, and in a way shared sort of a perspective and a common outlook on world affairs. And when I was working for Chancellor Wernitzky, he was working for the foreign minister. He was heading the office of the foreign minister. He was then political director, and so on. So we had a working relationship as well, not only a friendship. And even today, I have to say, there is rarely a day where I don't think of him, or in one occasion or the other say, this is something I would like to share with Ernst, and this is something I would like to discuss with him, and so on. We were very, very close friends. We are at the moment when the international system is in a period of change like we have not seen for several hundred years. This quote of Henry Kissinger and the recent international developments, but also Ernst Sucharipa's lifelong engagement in multilateral diplomacy, inspired me to choose multilateralism in crisis as the topic of tonight's talk. I, by intention, left it open whether we put an exclamation mark or a question mark. So we can come back to that perhaps at the end of the talk and agree whether we would put an exclamation mark or a question mark. I'm firmly convinced that this is a problem of utmost relevance, and the way multilateralism and multilateral diplomacy will evolve over the near future will have serious impact on a worldwide level. What are these implications, and what exactly do we mean by the term crisis? Most will take it to imply just an interruption, perhaps a deep and lengthier interruption in a long-term trend, a trend that will continue after the interlude of this longer or shorter, shallower or deeper crisis. Perhaps the term crisis, taken in that sense, might be appropriate to describe what is happening in multilateral diplomacy now. We might witness a deep recession in its development, yet this development would be bound to continue once the present obstacles have come to an end. It might be so. It might also be otherwise. We could be at a point in time where a long-term historic trend has been broken already and has become reversed. This prospect is worrying. It bodes ill for our future, and especially for the future of a mid-sized country like Austria, and for the future of a mid-sized continent, Europe, which by 2050 will hold just 7% of the world population and produce no more than 13% of the world's wealth. I still am unsure about which of the two alternative explanations of the present setbacks in multilateral diplomacy will prove to be the one fitting reality. History is shaped by humans. There are no immutable laws to guide it. Yet, on the other hand, there is also something termed path dependency by political science. Once a social or political trend has taken shape, it forms the expectations of all the political and intellectual actors, thus reinforcing the trend and making it difficult to change or reverse. And I fear that might prove true for the decline of multilateral diplomacy. Symptoms of that decline abound. With the looming prospect of a non-renewal of START, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, in February 2021, the last remaining impediment to a renewed and destabilizing arms race in nuclear weapons will be removed. That follows on the demise of the ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, also of the treaty prohibiting the use of anti-satellite weapons, or the demise of the treaty against the militarization of outer space. Of special concern to Europe is the termination of the INF Treaty on intermediate nuclear forces. Nuclear proliferation is bound to resume and to accelerate, not in spite, but largely because of US policies. Neither North Korea nor Iran are likely to cease their quest for nuclear weapons. Other nations, most likely in the Middle East or in Asia, are likely to follow their example. And so as to point to other examples of fateful disregard of the multilateral in other fields. An international tribunal established under the law of the Sea Convention had ruled on the issue of the shoals and reefs placed in the ocean between the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and China. Before being built into military fortresses by China, these shoals or reefs had not been suited for permanent human habitation. Contrary to the claims of China, they thus could not aspire to having their own territorial waters and their own exclusive economic zone. The tribunal rejected the Chinese claims, yet its ruling was dismissed by China as nothing more than a piece of waste paper. The end of the Cold War had nourished the vision of a common area of peace, cooperation, and prosperity between Vladivostok and Vancouver, built, guarded, and nourished by the OSCE. That dream or vision has vanished. OSCE is stuck in mutual distrust and hostility. Its carefully crafted status for the Crimean Peninsula has not prevented the illegal annexation of the Crimean by Russia. And even the core provision of the UN Charter on the illegitimacy of war had not kept Russia from invading the Ukraine, thus shattering the post-World War II order in Europe. Not that the other side, namely the United States, would care much about that order or the UN Charter either, with the US President threatening to obliterate Iran and rupturing the web of economic interdependence by unilateral economic sanctions that run counter to international obligations and the raison d'etre of international organizations like the World Trade Organization. Donald Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, had advocated bombing Iran before. He has little esteem for the United Nations, which are core and symbol of multilateralism. He claimed that one could easily lop off 10 of the 38 stories of the UN Secretariat building in New York. It would not make a difference. Behind this view of the world and of international relation looms a philosophy that differs starkly from the one that formed US policies over the past decades, that formed the policies of the United States, perceiving itself as being the benign hegemon and sustaining a world order, while it suited its long-term interests, was also promoting the public good of global cooperation. The most recent US national security strategy of 2017 is brutally frank about the dramatic shift in the US position. The strategy is based on the view of the world as a competitive arena rather than a community of nations. The greater the independence of these nations, the fewer the links that tie them together, the smaller the global common that should be entrusted to common care, the better for the United States and for the world. According to the letter of the doctrine, the world is dangerous and sovereign states are the best hope for a peaceful world. Such is the claim. As we have been reminded over the last weeks and in the run-up for the elections to the European Parliament, that US doctrine resonates well and neatly with the Le Pens, Salvinis, Orbans and others, and would be supported too by quite some politicians in Austria. The former White House advisor and right-wing ideologue Steve Bannon is crisscrossing our continent to weld a transatlantic axis based on such a philosophy. Well, we have had such a world before, a world shaped by boundless competition between nation-states, each of them aiming to maximize power at the expense of others. 2 world wars should have taught us otherwise. But, as it seems, we are about to forget these lessons. What is behind these dramatic shifts, this turn of the tide? It is not that, that basic human aspirations would have changed. The 4 freedoms, once proclaimed by US President F.D. Roosevelt, have now grown into the 17 Sustainable Development Goals as they had been approved by a UN summit in September of 2015. Peace, health, education, work for all, protection of the environment, gender equality, and so on. But the political, institutional, and perhaps also social ladder leading up to these goals has been shattered. We all might aspire to peace and prosperity, but which international, global institutions, which political resolve is in place to bring about the realizations of these worthy goals? For a long term, we all seem to have been able to agree at least on the basics of an institutional political setup of the world order that, while accommodating diversity, was still solid enough to inspire confidence in progress. That confidence is lost, and we must ask why. We must ask this question while taking a very long-term view covering the millennia of human development. So what has happened? As the German philosopher Hegel remarked, the scope of human cooperation has steadily expanded all over these millennia, from cooperation within families to cooperation within clans, then tribes, then fiefdoms, and then to cooperation within states. For Hegel, the cooperation within states was the end of history. Institutionalized cooperation could not safely expand beyond the confines of the state. In retrospect, that claim is ridiculous, and quite contrary. In 1795, it was Immanuel Kant who, in his essay on eternal peace, saw peace as the result of treaties between states in the international relations based on international law. It would be absolutely disastrous were all cooperation between states and all cooperation between citizens of various states was suddenly cut. Look into our pockets, our menus, our daily consumption of information, our office desk or workbenches. It would be hard to find a single item that in one way or another would not have this extra border component. Why can we rely on the working of a China-produced charger for our cell phone? Why can we be certain that a cotton grower in Egypt who produces the cotton for our shirts will continue the production of cotton? He will do so because he is certain of being paid and certain of receiving the fertilizer for his fields. Consider the implications of a rising availability of food, even in light of a rapidly expanding world population. Is this not also clearly a result of cross-border cooperation and cross-border connections? The row of such examples is an endless one. The web of this interaction has become very dense today. Of course, those involved are not only states. Many other actors are involved. Corporations, of course, international organizations, the global network of banking and finance, worldwide scientific cooperation, non-governmental organizations, quasi-non-governmental organizations, etc., etc. In short, international cooperation has expanded into global governance. Yet, while the base of global governance is wide and a diverse one, it is at the same time a fragile one, a base with many gaps and holes. The glue holding together the base for all those cross-border interactions is trust, and that trust has to be built and sustained by institutions. In absence of trust and in absence of institutions to sustain trust, cooperation will wither. And I'm very much afraid that this is what we witness happening. Let's first look at the most tangible cause of this decline. The cause most obvious at first sight is the sheer viscosity of international institutions, their failure to adapt to changing circumstances. The most notorious example is the UN Security Council. It was designed as a great power consortium destined to provide the mighty counterpoint to the UN General Assembly with its cacophony of voices. Its composition reflected and had to reflect the big power constellation as it existed at the end of World War II. Next to China and the US, one counts now 3 European states among the 5 permanent members. Until today, that composition of the Security Council has remained unchanged. India will soon have the world's largest population. It has no permanent presence in the Security Council. Neither has one Latin American or one African state. Little also has changed in the overly ritualistic procedures of the UN that frequently lead to absurd results, such as the entrenched, cruel dictatorships having their say in the Human Rights Council. I remember when Ernst and I were both at the United Nations, the German UN representative Rüdiger von Lechmar was president of the General Assembly, and he was a great guy, and he amused himself by writing the so-called United Nations Standard Multipurpose Speech, which was a speech that could be held on each and every occasion, and where he left appropriate spaces to include a quote from Socrates to Napoleon and other selected authors. And so it was a wonderful document, and it was a superb example for the ritualistic procedures under which the UN system and the agencies and so on labor. But that holds true also for other important international organizations such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, where Europe is overrepresented, with rising powers like China being underrepresented by a vast margin. According to theory, and if push comes to shove, it would be states in the end that hold, so as if by default, the ultimate political legitimacy. This legitimacy could correlate to the capacity of having the final and decisive say in shaping the relations between the nations of the globe. This, at least, is how they perceive their role. And of course, states and their political leaders have vested interest in maintaining that view. It is the base of their power. However, the view might no longer fit. No state, and not even a mighty one, would have the power to shape a reality to conform to this view. No state, not even a mighty one, has control of what crosses its borders. No state, and even the most dictatorial one, can count on the unconditional loyalty of its citizens. No state, and not even one with a vast internal market, would be able to provide from its own resources and on its own territory all that would be needed for the comfort and even the survival of its citizens. Thus, there is in an area of high political relevance, which nonetheless lies beyond the area of politics legitimized in a national context. It is expanding, and much of everyday life is affected by what happens in this realm. Yet there is no political entity, no polity, to fill that void beyond the reach of national politics and provide it with political legitimacy. Citizens are no longer able to affect via politics what affects them. They perceive of this realm beyond the reach of national politics as being filled by obscure forces shaped by power-hungry elites that disregard their preferences and demean and belittle their identity. Developments in Europe, Brexit in particular, provide ample evidence for this long-hidden and now erupting anger and resentment of citizens fixed in the confining parameters of purely national politics. There is reason for the resentment and anger not having erupted earlier already. While it was true that in the past too that this realm of interstate and global had not been accessible to national politics, actions therein at least have seemed to have been guided by convictions, worldviews and values that were shared between Europe and the United States and that were assumed to be thus universal. For quite some time, countries beyond the confines of the transatlantic community pretended to share this belief in the universality of the Atlantic values. They no longer do. India, China, Russia, much of the Muslim world now proudly insist on their following a different lodestar. I dare to argue that it would today no longer be possible to find consensus on a text as basic as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Also, as to quote another example, it would no longer be possible today to agree on the founding of an international atomic energy agency with power to effectively control the use and supply of fissile material, or on an international court of justice. In the absence of consensus on such basic aims and values, multilateral cooperation and multilateral diplomacy face big hurdles indeed. Increasingly, multilateral diplomacy has lagged behind the tasks imposed by the rapid changes in today's world. In the 16th century, the world's oceans became accessible to the sailing ships of competing European powers. The ships of these imperial powers and of the buccaneers in their tow fought each other ferociously at the price of gain for none and losses for all. That ended in the 17th century with the establishment of a regime defining the ocean as a global common forever connected to the name of Hugo Grotius. In the mid-19th century, railroads and steamships had come to provide reliable long-distance transport. Very shortly thereafter, an international regime was put in place guaranteeing the fast and secure cross-border delivery of mail and information. This was the foundation of the second and the third oldest international organization, the International Telecommunication Union in 1865 and the Universal Postal Union in 1874. The widespread use of poison gas in World War I prompted the 1925 Geneva Convention against the use of chemical weapons. The development and use of nuclear weapons at the eve of World War II prompted in 1957 the establishment of the International Atomic Energy Agency. As these examples demonstrate, in the past, global challenges and tasks had been met rather promptly by the establishment of appropriate international institutions. Can we be sure that the same would hold true for present tasks and challenges today? I wonder. The Internet became operative in the mid-1980s. It has vastly expanded in scope and more dramatically in its impact on politics, the economy, privacy and social fabric, and last not least on basic security. No global institution is in place to govern it and to secure its being used for the common good. Quite on the contrary. Just as the oceans in the 16th century, the new internet ocean of worldwide connectivity and interdependence is filled by roaming buccaneers and warships of antagonistic states. The prospects can be quite daunting. Few developments have been as destabilizing as the massive proliferation of small weapons such as assault rifles. Weaker states, and there are many of them, have thus effectively lost their monopoly of coercive power and turned into failed states. There were few attempts to stem the tide through joint international action with Austrian involvement, but these have not been effective. All these examples are to show that international politics and multilateral diplomacy in its service has failed to do what had to be done in the past: protect the common interest of states and their citizens in an increasingly interdependent world. April 24th, 2019, by the United Nations has been declared the International Day of Multilateralism, an absolute first. UN Secretary General Guterres delivered a convincing statement on the importance of multilateral cooperation in view of the magnitude of the global problems, but also as a bulwark against the destructive power of populism and nationalism. In a joint press conference, the French and the German foreign ministers declared their intention to start officially an alliance for multilateralism at the opening of this year's General Assembly. Let us hope that this is not only a good intention, but that action will follow. A few words in the end, specifically in Austria. Austria once held a prominent place in multilateral diplomacy and in the creation of global legal instruments for the peace and the care of our planet. I won't go as far back as the Congress of Vienna, but stick to the more recent past and just mention, for example, the Vienna Conventions of Diplomatic and Consular Relations, the Austrian contribution to the Law of the Sea Treaty, the International Space Law or International Environment Law, and also the Washington Principles on the restitution of Nazi-looted art. Ernst Sucharipa, as I said, one of my closest friends whom I mourn and miss, had been closely involved in many such endeavors, and in particular in the last one I mentioned. We owe him thanks and our resolve to reconnect to this Austrian tradition in multilateral diplomacy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Nowotny, for the words that come to mind is comprehensive, thoughtful, and unfortunately it's not your fault, rather sobering overview. And you left us time for a discussion, and so I wonder who is willing to break the ice. Yes, please. And if I may ask you to say who you are. I know a few persons present, but obviously not everybody.
Okay, hi, I'm Min Zhuanyan from Mass 1. I'm a Mass 1 student. I have two questions. The first is about the changing dynamic of this multilateralism. As you mentioned, it has changed very tremendously in the past 2 years. But I was wondering that if one man can change this process in such a dramatic way, that means that the multilateralism itself is very fragile. And my second question is about the Europeans' white paper. It has recently changed its tones about China. They claim China from a strategic partner to a competitor. So in your regard, what does this kind of change means? Thank you.
Thank you. Eva, you want to respond right away?
Immediately?
Yeah, you decide.
Yeah,
Good.
why not? Well, I think you're quite right in your analysis. I mean, multilateralism is fragile. It is under attack, as we have seen, as we have tried to demonstrate, and it needs to be protected. It needs to be cared for and developed, and it needs a lot of political intention. The reason for this is, and that's why I'm so deeply convinced that we need a functioning global order based on multilateralism, is that the problems that we face from environmental issues, climate change, overpopulation, migration, natural disasters, to problems connected to the internet, to scientific developments whose impact we can even just start to guess at the moment, is extremely important, and we need some kind of regulatory system to protect and protect also, I mean, the interests especially of countries that are not so powerful and not so important that they can do it or can try to do it on their own. That's one of the reasons. The second thing is that in Europe, well, there is at the moment, let me put it that way, a lot of problems in the relationship between Europe and the United States. There are many issues which are of importance where we do no longer see eye to eye. Yeah? We always had these issues in the past. Also, there have on social questions, on the death penalty, on arms control, and so there are a number of issues where also in the past Europe and the United States were not seeing eye to eye. But at the moment this goes deeper. And the view that I've tried also to sketch in this brief analysis of the new national security doctrine of the United States and the outlook of President Trump and his team on world affairs is not the outlook that is shared by the Europeans. We view international relations differently. And I've just read in the last issue of the magazine, which I'm sure you have here at the Diplomatic Academy, Foreign Policy, an analysis by the Deputy National Security Advisor, who writes about Europe in such a derogatory, ridiculing, disrespectful way that is really, I mean, it's shattering when you read that. When President Trump says that all the efforts that the Europeans put in place for common security and defense, as fragile as they are, yeah, and we are just at the beginning of a road here, are hostile to the United States, or when he says that the European Union is no longer a friend and an ally, but a foe and an enemy and a competitor, I mean, that shows that there is really sort of a serious problems in the relationship between sort of Europe and the United States. And we can only hope that with political changes, probably on both sides, the necessary means will be found to correct, because the relationship between the United States and Europe, in my opinion, is still one of the most relevant today.
Thank you.
Now we have Frau Botschafterin.
Claudia Fritsche, former Liechtenstein diplomat and former colleague of the ambassador. If you allow me, my question centers on a development that took place last weekend, the elections to the European Parliament, and I think Ernst, as you are and I am, we were and are also firm believers in the European institutions. How would you interpret the unusually high voters' participation? Do you interpret it as a sign of renewed trust that Europeans develop in the institution of the EU, or do you interpret it as an outcry, as a manifestation of the people of the European countries that feel that their politicians in Brussels and the EU institutions need to listen more to them?
Thank you. Eva.
That's a very, very timely question, as we are in the midst of analyzing the result of these elections. I think there are many points that you have touched in your question. Let me start, first of all, by the increased voters' participation. If I look at the way Austria approached the parliamentary elections now, it was, in my recollection, the first time, and I've seen many in the last 25 years, that were really a debate took place publicly in the papers, in the media, in television, between the candidates in many about European issues. Yeah? And it was really for the first time that you had the whole scope, also in the public debate, from a very restrictive view, saying we need to transfer more power back to the nation state, the Commission is too powerful, interferes with our daily life to a degree which is no longer acceptable, to, on the other side of the spectrum, the vision of the United States of Europe, joint European army, and so forth. So you had this debate, and a similar debate, as we know from opinion polls now, took place in almost all the other 27 members of the European Union. I leave out Great Britain intentionally because that was sort of a special case. Yeah? And I think that special case of Britain, Brexit, and the consequences and the debates that we have seen, and the way this has been discussed, as well as the deterioration in the relationship to the United States, as well as the problems with Russia and so forth, and the growing involvement of China on the international scene, have made people rather alert that sort of what we have in Europe is something important that needs to be protected. And we have seen Europe-wide opinion polls that that show and manifest that increased interest in European. One sometimes would not believe it if you listen just to political rhetoric. Yeah? But we know from opinion polls that 2/3 majority of the Austrian citizens are firmly convinced that the membership in the European Union is a good thing for our country, and that European cooperation and integration should rather be strengthened in many areas such as security, social issues, tax issues, etc. So that's one part of the question. There have been, I mean, the result of the European election is, of course, a massive change. Yeah? The European Parliament will look completely different than the European Parliament which we have known for the last years. The two major groups, the Conservatives and the Social Democrats, no longer have this automatic majority. They will need coalition partners. But then when you look at the division, the political division of the whole spectrum, you will see that there is still a rather solid pro-European bloc, yeah, composed from from the conservative parties, the social democratic parties, the liberal parties in ALDE, the Greens, if you count them, and splinter groups to the left and to the right that will form sort of a pro-European group. What has not happened, although the results in some of the countries are very worrying, yeah, is that the predicted onslaught of the populist, right-wing, nationalistic movements has not materialized. Yeah? It is worrying when you see that, for instance, in France, the movement of Madame Le Pen has topped the party of President Macron. Yeah? It is worrying when you look at Italy, it is worrying when you look at Hungary. But in the long run, what they have set out to do has not happened. They will not be powerful enough to destroy sort of the fabric of European integration. What is a concern is less, in my opinion, the work of the European Parliament, because there, I mean, they will do their business, and I think you can rely on the checks and balances within the different groups that are active in the Parliament. But what is worrying is rather how politicians in the national governments will react to it, how they will perceive their role, and whether they will resist the temptation to give in to too much nationalistic, populist rhetoric, and so on. This is the biggest worry that I have at the moment. Less the composition of the European Parliament. And I mean, to come back to your first question, of course, this concern that I was trying to outline has resulted in a much higher voters' participation in the election. I mean, we have now had a voters' participation of close to 60%, which is unheard. I mean, it has never happened before.
Thank you. Ambassador Volte.
Volte, Austrian Society for European Politics. Looking back into the history of multilateralism, who were the leading personalities, starting, let's say, in 44, 45, and then leading up to the present? Who were the leading personalities who shaped multilateralism during these decades? And where are these leading personalities now on the international scene who would favor and develop a new kind, probably a new kind of multilateralism? Even also on the European level, we were together on the panel today with Eva and myself, and we discussed the Treaty of Lisbon. The Treaty of Lisbon is in a very, well, I couldn't say an extraordinary document. And now we are talking about reforming it. Well, let's be very, very careful about that. We know how long it took us to shape and draft the Treaty of Lisbon. We know how difficult it is. Now we have all kinds of things being mentioned as possible areas of reform regarding the Treaty of Lisbon. But anyway, this is my question: Who were the ones in the past? Who would you detect at the present and possibly for the future? And the same goes to you, Hanspeter.
I'm a non-playing captain. If you know Davis.
Hey,
okay.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Well, Wolfgang, I mean, this is of course a $1 million question. Yeah, it's first of all, I would start out by saying that I mean, multilateralism and multilateral diplomacy is not an invention of the 20th or the 21st century. Yeah? It goes way back, and I mean, what we have seen in the dealings and wheelings of the Holy Roman Empire of German nation all over Europe was, in fact, a lot of multilateral diplomacy. That was it was dealing, it was treaty making, it was negotiating, it was coming to consensus. It was breaking apart, and then and so on. So once a historian, always a historian, yeah. And I have to take the longer view. Then you had, I've mentioned Kant, for instance, and his principles on eternal peace. Yeah, I mean this is a document about multilateral diplomacy and about international law and about international cooperation. You come to Wilson and his 14 points, yeah? League of Nations, the first big organized enterprise of multilateral diplomacy, orchestrated and so on, failed abysmally, yeah? And then you had, after World War II, the renewed attempt, I mean, in the foundation of the United Nations. And this was at that time a handful of people. It was not like today the 193. I don't know how many were in the San Francisco conference. It was perhaps 40 or 50 countries.
50 plus.
Yeah. And these were people who were under the immediate impact of the experiences of World War II, highly idealistic, highly motivated. And if you read some of the speeches, or also I've been, by my function as president of the Austrian UNESCO Commission, I've been reading some of the documents that led up to the foundation of UNESCO. Yeah, I mean there was an idealism, and these were people who were not only politicians, but they were philosophers and thinkers and so on, scientists and so on, involved in this endeavor. And then, of course, I mean, as it goes, organizations develop their weaknesses, they develop problems, they develop their own idiosyncrasies and so on, and they lose some of that. They become involved in rituals that take them away a little bit from the real concerns and the real issues. And if you say, well, the people today who could, who would have the same impact, for instance, as those founding fathers and so on, also the founding fathers of the European Union, not to leave them out. If we knew the answer, it would be great. I mean, I'm sure there are some, yeah, but where they are, everybody's guess. Yeah. Macron, yes, beset as he is by political problems, but he at least is a politician who has a very clear vision of what Europe should be. Yeah. And it's a great pity, and we have also talked about that this morning, that there was such an inadequate response to that vision. Yeah? And this, I mean, has to be said, is very much a grave fault of the German government, because they left him standing in the rain. Yeah.
And now he has lost in France.
And now he has lost in France, yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. Bert Theuermann is my name, Foreign Ministry. I had the honor to work under Ernst in New York for several years, together with Lily and later on with Hans, who had great masters in the Foreign Ministry for many years. And this was certainly forming years for me. I think you gave a clear answer that multilateralism is in crisis. That seems to be very clear. I also have, this is also my observation in daily work, if you want to say so. You spoke a lot about the US and the US government. I don't think it would change with the change of government in the US. It's much more fundamental than that. You speak so much about Russia, but also Russia is not a friend of multilateralism. And China is speaking a lot of multilateralism, but they mean something quite different. Chinese characteristics. So there are serious challenges, and when, for instance, the German and French foreign minister presented a proposal for an alliance of multilateralism at the Munich Security Conference, the big talk there was that there are the big players out there, and will Europe be a play field for players? So at the same time, we also see many efforts while the EU rhetorically continues to speak out in favor of multilateralism. There are efforts underway that how can the EU become a player? Strategic autonomy, PESCO, etc. The question is, does the EU need to be more of a serious player to be an effective supporter of multilateralism versus a contradiction? Is the EU even able to get there? So that's a big question. So that would be, I would be quite interested to hear from you, because also need to explain when it comes to effective multilateralism and the support for a rules-based international order. We have a number of EU countries which don't fully subscribe to rule of law internally. How can we be a strong supporter of rules-based international systems? So we're also very much beaten in our own systems.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, unfortunately, your question does do nothing to leaven the atmosphere of doom and gloom. I mean, you pinpoint very, very clearly the problem that exists also in the European Union. We have now the chance, we are getting a new commission, we are getting new people in, we are getting a new president of the commission. And there is such, I think if you interpret also what has been happening in this election and the movements that were taking part all over Europe, if you interpret that correctly, there might be a kind of a resolve to do better than the last commission has been doing. There are certain issues that have to be settled. I mean, it's one of the issues, we talked about that also in the morning. You cannot continue with the unanimity rule. I mean, in the European Union, we have to come to majority voting, and that of course implies that all the people who will then subscribe to the necessary respect and democratic respect for decisions that are taken by majority rule. That you don't have then situations say, okay, we have been defeated and these are the awful results and so on, this is our enemy. The second thing is that we really need to speak with one voice, yeah? And the European Union still has this tendency of working like sort of a chamber orchestra for solo instruments, yeah? And that it cannot go on like that. I mean, if you want to have an impact, you have to come out with clear positions and defend them and so on. We are now in a very serious issue with the United States about the consequences of the Iran treaty. Yeah? A treaty in which the European Union has, together with Russia, has to be said, has invested almost 10 years of intense, painstaking negotiations to come to an agreement that has finally satisfied all parties involved. Yeah? What do we do now that we are under constant criticism, and not only criticism, but also attack with economic measures and so forth from the side of the United States, who has withdrawn from the agreement? We do not have the means to react decisively. And that is an issue. I'm not arguing for a renewal or a renegotiation of the Lisbon Treaty or another basic convention that would take years and be extremely difficult. But if the European Union would decide under the new leadership to utilize all the powers that are there in the Lisbon Treaty effectively, already that would be a great step forward.
Thank you. Ambassador Winkler?
I'm tired.
But not tired.
Thank you very much, Eva. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. It's always enriching. And I think we both share our memory of Ernst. We both worked with him quite intensively. At the end of your speech, you talked about Austria and Austria's contribution to multilateralism all these beautiful things beautiful people did. I wonder if you would agree with me that ever since our membership in the European Union in '95, the interest and engagement in classical multilateralism outside the European Union has dropped dramatically. I was permanent representative of Austria to the Council of Europe from '92 to '96. So it's still 1 year after the membership of Austria in the EU. The interest in the Council of Europe dropped dramatically. I remember when Schüssel, foreign minister, went through all the departments in the foreign ministry, and he came to the department that was responsible for the Council of Europe. He asked, "What? The Council of Europe does still exist? I didn't know that." And the same is, I'm afraid, true for all other global institutions, like including the United Nations. And for me, the worst example of anti-multilateralism was the Austrian position on the UN Pact on Migration. I mean, this would definitely not have happened before we joined the European Union, because now the European Union is such a predominant factor in our foreign policy. And what you now addressed, what Bert Deuermann addressed, is, can the European Union really be more effective in international organizations? The debate popped up again, should the one seat remaining for the European Union after Brexit for France, should this be a European seat? But there is no way that it can ever happen, at least not in the, I'm not talking about my generation, I'm talking about 2 generations hence. We still have a 3-way split in many international organizations about questions of the Middle East. We still have all member states having slightly different views on most issues in the United Nations and many other issues. I am quite pessimistic that the European Union, which is so much occupied with itself, and will be occupied with itself in the foreseeable future, including a treaty reform if it ever comes about, that I don't think we will really achieve a more prominent, significant role in international organizations such as the UN and its agencies.
Thank you. Eva, your comment.
Yeah. Well, of course, it's a very sobering analysis, and I would agree largely with it, because what we have to see that our membership in the European Union has, of course, changed significantly the way we work. Yeah? And it has absorbed a lot of attention and a lot of capacity just into the workings of the European Union. So when you talk about sort of UN, General Assembly, I mean, we repeat the General Assembly in consultations within the European Union, trying to form common positions, writing statements, preparing interventions, explanations about, and so forth. So the room for decisive unilateral initiatives has become a little bit smaller. Nevertheless, there are a few where we have done something, and I recall, for instance, the Austrian initiative on the responsibility to protect, that this was a good example, the involvement on landmines, the small arms, and so. So there are...
Nuclear weapons ban.
Nuclear weapons ban. There are things where we have worked, and which shows that you can still do it if you want. I wonder, and this is not there's also a real answer to your question, but I wonder whether something is going to change when Britain really leaves the European Union. I know from our people in New York that whenever they tried to do something as the European Union, it was blocked by Great Britain, who absolutely refused to have the European Union in the international organizations as sort of a real actor. Yeah? Same is due here for OSCE, where the EU is not even allowed, the EU Commission is not allowed to speak, but has to hide behind one of the member states who is just in the presidency. So whether with the Britain leaving the European Union, whether this will have a positive influence on the way the European Union manifests itself in international organizations stands to be seen. I mean, the hope is there. And I would like to add something to what you said. It seems to me that we have not used the full potential of our membership in the European Union either. Yeah? We could have a much stronger influence within the European Union in shaping foreign policy positions and in bringing interests to bear. We have let things slide in a way, and we have not really come to terms with the power that also a small country with good initiatives, good thinking, good diplomacy can have within the European Union in shaping events. Inshallah. Yeah.
Let me make a proposal. I've seen two more hands. Let's hear the two, what I suggest would be the final questions. The proposal is, why don't we engage in bilateralism and small group multilateralism? Because if I look, you see, you can't see it, but there are bottles and snacks on tables. And so with your agreement, you'll have the final word. This is how we could proceed.
This is what our foreign minister has called the elegance of bilateralism.
Yes.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure again to pay tribute to Ernst Sucharipa, who was a great friend and colleague. I'm at a disadvantage because of two things. First, I'm an American, so I don't know much about anything outside the U.S. And my worst disadvantage is a lawyer. So I don't know anything about history or any of all of that. So my challenge, I have two comments. One is a question to you, a challenge to be optimistic. Can you give us what can we look forward to? How can we turn it around? And that leads to my second question coming from the U.S. and what has been known as the deep state in the U.S., which I think would be considered the permanent secretariat, the career bureaucrats, the career diplomats, and how they are, of course, as far as Trump and Bolton are concerned, are almost treasonous in terms of continuing policies before Trump and not admitting it. So undermining the Trump policies. And he, of course, is going after them in the Justice Department, the FBI, but I know from friends in the American Foreign Service, they have some hope that this may be able to keep multilateralism alive. And of course, it's a rearguard action, but there are quite a few things that are not explained to the political appointees from what is called the deep state. My second question is history. You have examples in the past from Europe or elsewhere where you've had reactionary political class take over a government, but where your permanent staff, your career diplomats have maintained alive the multiculturalism, the multilateralism, the democracy, the principles that we all share, at least for a short period, so that it can take over again when you have a change in the politicians.
Eva.
Mm-hmm. Well, you touch a little bit on the ethos of the Austrian civil service here, where we have always maintained that governments come and go, but we stay, and we are the permanent, and we are the continuity, and we keep things going. Through my friends in Washington, I also follow the developments in the State Department and the confusion that is there, and the disorientation, where people very strongly believe, and through their formation and their experiences, also in the outside world, in the interaction with the outside world, see what has to be done, yeah? And where they have sort of from the top down policies dictated to them, which they are convinced are detrimental to the country and to the world at large. So there is a big issue here, and I don't know how this is going to I mean, this is a question of internal domestic policies in the United States, and there is nothing that we can suggest also how this is going to play out. But it's a very, very difficult situation for many well-trained, experienced American diplomats. It also leads to the fact that the State Department has thinned out considerably. The Austrian Foreign Ministry has shrunk over the years to, I think now, something like 1,100 something people. A reputable law firm in New York has more lawyers working for them than the Austrian Foreign Ministry. But this is the outflow of experienced people from the State Department is really worrying, because you lose a lot of knowledge, wisdom, experience, continuity, and so on, that is lost forever. Yeah, I mean, that's not a very satisfactory answer, but that's how I see it. Yeah.
Thank you. Lily.
I am very happy to hear that there's the resilience of the Foreign Service also in the US, and that the fear which has been created top-down among officials who were working for the state, State Department, whatever, had experienced because of the way the president is acting. And I was there at the time where this came out. I was there just for a conference where this was very visible. So I can understand the fear, and I remember other times in the States when there were conflicts, and who was not for the military engagement, who was not a friend anymore. So in the universities we were afraid to speak out. So I'm happy that this resilience is there, and I hope very much that better times will come. To what you were saying about multilateralism, for me, multilateralism is in the first place the UN, because that was our experience. Ernst was a multilateralist, really ingrained multilateralist. And he made me the same. And we had experienced in our 2 stays in New York different ways of the Americans dealing with the UN. UN was never loved among Americans, never. And when you traveled around and spoke at Rotary clubs, etc., they were always waiting for the black helicopters of the UN coming and doing all kinds of things. So you see, it is a rather naive country, partly. And this to explain to them what multilateralism and what the UN means is difficult. But when you tell them, when each of you give us $1, then we can keep up our work, because the UN didn't pay their, the US didn't pay their dues in the 70s and later on. So you can explain it to the people. But when you have a top guy who does what your president at the moment does, there's no chance for the multilateralism. It's very, 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 very sad. And I hope very much it will change with the next administration. And what you said about EU, and we could do more as Austria. Yes, we could do more. Because when I remember, we always were a small country, but how much could we reach within the UN? We were very successful in the UN as a small country. And we must try to do the same in the EU. It does not depend on the size. It depends on the motivation, also in having the backing by the ministry, and motivation and resilience also there. And one word which I'm missing so much in the last 10, 20 years, when we talk about multilateralism, talk about global politics, where is solidarity going? Is there solidarity among the people? Do we think what we can do for others? I think that's an important point, and we should think back. This word is not existing anymore. Thank you.
Yes.
Eva?
Yeah, you're completely right. I mean, what can I say? You're completely right. To your last point, Lily, solidarity. I've always found it fascinating that for many, many years we have characterized cohesion and cohesion funds as one of the best examples of European Union cooperation and integration. This principle that you invest in the development of weaker regions sort of for the benefit of all and that everybody will win. This has completely disappeared. The cohesion funds are still there, yeah, but you don't talk about them. And since people sometimes pinpoint it to the beginning of the financial and economic crisis, 2008. Since then, sort of the concept of sharing, of investing for the weaker to bring them up, of solidarity and so forth, exacerbated then, of course, with the political fallout of the Greek crisis and so on, has made that completely disappear in the European Union. That does not mean that the concept of solidarity itself has disappeared. Yeah, it has disappeared in a way out of the political arena, but people, and I know that because I'm also involved with charities, are enormously generous in giving and responding to crises and so on. They are very deeply involved in what is happening now in Mozambique after the natural disaster, or in children's issues and so on. And so solidarity on a personal level is still there. And I would perhaps suggest that also with a bit of political involvement, this can be tapped and brought out to a larger level. As far as the American reaction to United Nations is concerned, the picture varies. Yeah? I've just seen not so long ago an opinion poll that was conducted by the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, where the response of people to the United Nations is a much more positive one than one would assume from sort of political rhetoric and so on. President Obama has paid all the dues. Yeah. At the same time, they have dropped out without a moment hesitation of UNESCO, for instance, and so forth. So it's the picture is varied.
Thank you, Eva. May I now ask the Sucharipa to say a few words?
Famous last words at a lecture like this. First of all, I want to thank Eva for the wonderful way you conducted this lecture and that you accepted our invitation. You and Tomia belong to the almost oldest friends, and I say oldest friends because I think it's ridiculous. We all can speak also about age. It doesn't hurt.
friends of longest standing, and we had wonderful times together in our lives. It's great that you all remember Ernst so well. I thank Hanspeter, because he was the spiritus rector of the whole thing, and he's keeping it up through the third or fourth leadership of this academy after Ernst left it. So this is really wonderful. I thank you, Ambassador Brix, for having the lecture. I thank all of you for having come. I think it's not only friends, it's students, which is wonderful to see. And I think it was a very, on the one hand, depressing analysis in your lecture. But whenever one thing I learned in my life, whenever you think you have reached the bottom, it will go up again. And I think with this spirit, we should have a glass of wine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming. And Eva, again, thank you. It was a remarkable presentation you gave. And now, the informal part.